Welcome back to The Cure, everyone. In this episode, we're going to be talking about Goldlink's brand new album, what he considers to be his debut album, Diaspora. So Goldlink would consider this to be his debut album, and in that sense, I am very impressed with it. While a lot of us have certainly heard his music before, I think he really comes into his own with a lot of diverse and interesting musical styles, and a lot of really confident hooks and verses throughout this entire album. We also have a lot of great and really creative features on this album that are not put to waste. They really fit in on the songs that take place in. This album is 14 tracks and about 40 minutes long. It's very meaty. There's definitely a lot of musical content here, and I really don't think too much of it is put to waste. Throughout this entire album, we have a very relaxed, tropical vibe going on throughout most of the songs. We have a lot of really nice instrumentals with a diverse instrument group across each and every song. You do see a lot of other musical styles interpreted by Goldlink throughout this album. He typically raps quickly, although not excessively fast, like maybe a Logic or an Eminem recently or something like that. He's very diverse with his lyrics, likely not very repetitive, and on this album especially has a lot of really killer hooks as well. As I mentioned a minute ago, the features on this album are really strong. There are a good handful of them, although some of them are used a little bit more artistically than just a simple verse or something like that. I think Goldlink is certainly able to curate and create a song on his own, so the features are used very well. As far as pros and cons though, I think there are generally a lot more pros than cons while going throughout this album. I think the theme is kept together very well, although not overplayed while listening. You definitely get a good break from it in a few places. I definitely think the first half of the album is stronger than the back half. There are a couple of songs that just aren't quite as interesting with their instrumentation, and I think some of the tracks begin to lag a little bit by the end. I also think the finisher is kind of weak, maybe even one of the weakest tracks on the album. But far and away, the rest of the songs are really nice on this thing. We have a lot of really nice light, soft keys and guitars throughout all of the instrumentals, a lot of really creative melodies, and a lot of really relaxing and confident bass lines. And then some tracks we see a ton of experimentation, either in the formula, verse, chorus, bridge, something like that, being totally twisted, or a complete experimentation with the instrumental or the features. We have one song in particular that just goes totally off the wall in that sense. But generally speaking, I think the strongest things about this album are its instrumentation and the consistency that it sticks with that general tropical relaxed theme throughout the entire album, as well as just the lyricism that Goldlink brings to the table and the curation he has with these features. They certainly aren't wasted, and they all bring their own part to play to this album as well. The only real negative thing about this album is that I think there are a few throwaway tracks, a couple of instrumentals that are a little bit less interesting here and there, but it's really pretty great throughout. Now on to the tracks. Joke Ting is the first real song after a short, strange little opening skit of sorts where we just listen to Goldlink running. And it is a really great kickoff to this album. It really emphasizes the very textbook theme that this album is going for. Ari Penn Smith is the feature on this album. I am honestly not familiar, but they sound exactly like The Weeknd, and I thought it was The Weeknd before I even looked. It is a great feature though nonetheless, with a really impressive hook that's going to be followed by a ton of other really nice hooks. And again, like I mentioned previously, Goldlink plays on with this feature very well. Their voices work well together, and this beat is very relaxed, tropical, and exactly what the rest of the album is going to kind of mimic in some ways here and there. Maniac, I think, is particularly interesting because of its a little bit more dark, decrepit, but still kind of epic and theatrical beat. While the verse and the hook are not quite as interesting, they're still definitely hanging on, and the instrumental really brings this song to the forefront on this album. It's definitely a lot heavier, a lot easier to dance to, or something like that. And it's going to be a lot of people's pick for a popular track on this album because of that. It also features the first of what are a few beat switches on this album, so it's worth listening to the entirety of the songs when you're going through this because there's a lot of changes, and I pretty much like all of them, so that's another thing to mention. Now, Zulu Screams is probably my favorite song on the album for a few different reasons. I think it's certainly the most experimental. There's not really a formula that you can follow very closely or accurately. It has two really interesting and incredible features, and I think the song is certainly focused on a little bit more traditional form of music, both through the music itself and through the title. Now, the Zulu tribe is an African tribe, and I'm not exactly familiar with the two gentlemen featuring on this album. I think their names are Malik and Bibi. I'm sorry if I've butchered those names, but they really come to play on this song. This song is honestly a mix of maybe more traditional African music styles with some electronic dance dubstep mixed in, and they play together really well. We have the features with a lot more mixed and sampled vocals and some more traditional singing as well, that's kind of put together into this song in a very artistic way that doesn't really mimic it but makes really great use of it. And there's also a really incredible, intoxicating fast drum track on this as well that really speeds up the pace of the song. It's the fastest, most upbeat song on the album, and certainly the most interesting, so I think this one's definitely worth listening to. Coke White has Pusha T on it, and while there's a beat switch and Goldlink and Pusha's parts don't really mesh together very well, I think Pusha's verse is really nice and really long. A lot of really interesting bars all the way throughout, totally worth a listen. And then Goldlink's part isn't half bad either. They're just two very separate songs that aren't necessarily melded well together by this beat switch, although I like the parts separately, so they're not a bad whole either. And then You Say has Tyler the Creator and Jay Prince, a couple of other really incredible features, an awesome bass line, and more of a Latin influence on this song, although it still sticks to those really foundational themes on this album. Tyler's verse is really funny, really typical of Tyler, and he raps a little bit more traditionally than he does maybe on Igor or Flower Boy or something like that, so cool to hear a feature like that from him. There's also a lot of other really nice little light ambient instruments on this as well, some reverbed keys and something like that. Ambient sounds on point throughout this entire album. The Spanish song has a very 80s unapologetic dance hall vibe. It features a wood block and very theatrical, pumpy sounds, and a lot of cool audience samples as well, as if it was a live recording. It has kind of a weaker hook, but is certainly rememberable for its instrumental and some really cool keys throughout as well. No Lie with WizKid, yet another feature that works great and is a better use of a beat switch than Coke White with Pusha T, in my opinion. This is a very interesting track with certainly a lower start, and WizKid taking the lead with a very interesting and diverse verse. There's almost no beat, but they certainly bar together very well, and Goldlink actually takes part on this half of the song as well, so that makes it a little bit more interesting. And WizKid has a pretty sweet hook, nothing I've really heard before. And then finally, there's a beat switch, and Goldlink absolutely bars on a nice, really hard traditional trap beat. Although we really haven't heard too much like this throughout the album thus far, so it's a really nice change of pace and a really incredible verse from him too. The Tiff freestyle was an interesting kind of late interlude of sorts. It's a lot shorter and is kind of obviously just a freestyle from Goldlink. It's not half bad. It has a cool upbeat kind of city style instrumental on it that is really kind of interlude-y in that way, as kind of a break from the rest of this thematic style on the album. And it's really not half bad in that sense, although there's just not too much going on at all. It's a half-decent verse, and I think it fits the bill in that right. But unfortunately, the album just doesn't end as strong as it begins, with Rumble and Swoosh being a little bit weaker, a lot less interesting, both in their instrumentals, in their lyrics, and their hooks. I think Rumble as a whole is just a little bit obnoxious, with a little bit of a repetitive beat that just doesn't do it for me compared to some other tracks on this album. And Swoosh is unfortunately just far too traditional, although there's always a place for a slower, more introspective song on your album. It does not always have to be the last track as a send-off. It's so Drake, you know. It's very much a beat Drake would have on the end of one of his albums that I wouldn't be that impressed with either, and I'm not that impressed with it on this. There are some cool vocal samples and instruments near the end of the track, but not until the last like 20 seconds, so I wish we would have heard those throughout the rest of the song. But far and away, my reaction is positive to this album. I like many more of the tracks than I dislike, and overall I think Goldlink really hits this theme he was going for with Diaspora. The variety is absolutely there with a substantial theme that Goldlink stays on top of throughout this album, but diverges from in little ways and plays with different types of instruments, different types of breaks from that theme, and I really like the way he works with it throughout this album. The production and the instrumentation is all so interesting with so many different, tropical, laid-back reverb instrumentals and consistent bass and key lines that really carry a lot of the songs. And although they are unique in a lot of ways, especially on those really theme-driven songs, they are diverse enough in the way Goldlink raps and sings on top of them, and how the features work onto them as well. Creatively, I think this album works great. I think Goldlink certainly had something he was set on creating with this album, and really stayed on path with that. All of these songs fit in well with this theme, or have at least a certain aspect of it that play into the way they were put together. And this, style is something we've possibly heard in the past, maybe on Ty Dolla $ign's Beach House is maybe the most similar type of instrumentals I could compare it to, but these are different in their own way. They are possibly a little less laid back and a little more direct with their tone, and I like that. There's also certainly enough experimentation on here to make this unique, so I think Goldlink succeeds in that right as well. And finally, it's 14 tracks long. There's certainly enough to listen to on here for a good while. A lot of them are really great, so there's a lot of exploring to do on this album. It's 40 minutes of music, and I highly recommend that you guys check it out. So thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. Please don't forget to check out Goldlink's new album, and I will catch you on our next review.